Going into our second segment of Make Sense with Eliza Erickson, it's Deep Dive. In this segment, we get into the details about a specific innovation or technology issue and its implications for everyday people. Governments are going digital. I mean, they are digital, but to citizens, it can still feel like red tape, bad user interfaces. So today I'm asking Eliza about what innovation looks like in government and how we can make the citizen experience more efficient. So let's start with establishing the baseline, Eliza. Why do so many digital government services feel outdated or are frustrating to use?
This is like equal parts a foundational question and also equal parts, I think, there's so many factors that contribute to this. I think the first the first one is I just think governments for a long time have been building on legacy applications that can feel just a little bit big and clunky, and they're not incredibly nimble. And I think also with that can come kind of a lack of ability to make tweaks, to make updates kind of in the moment in ways that just kind of private sector, smaller, more nimble spaces can do, and I think do more often. So there is certainly like an actual technology component to, I think, some of that clunky user interface, and I think like the outdated feel that all of us experience sometimes when we use government platforms. I think there is a bigger, deeper answer though, which is just that government, from my experience, I think generally operates from a place of, if things are fine, if something is functioning fine, then that's good enough. And so we built this tax payment platform 25 years ago, and it's not the most bright and shiny and you know, user centric platform that's out there, but it gets the job done and it's still working and we have a good price on it and it's fine. So I think some of it is a little bit of just like a resistance to change, a resistance to update, and and in some places kind of like a lack of motivation or really understanding to provide better experiences. I think sometimes this manifests itself in kind of the bureaucratic processes and systems that make updates harder. Things like procurement being really complicated, and contracting being really complicated, and in-house talent versus contracting out talent. Like there's all those things kind of come together, I think, to um, create these technology systems that just don't feel um, like as cool, as smooth, as easy to use as what you might experience, let's say, from your like online banking portal, or from checking out on the gap.com, whatever it might be.
So I have a question. What you're saying is that there's kind of three big components: the technology itself, which legacy applications plague all big organizations, private or public. Um, the values and the culture of the organization. If it's fine, it's good enough, and there's some resistance to change. And then the actual bureaucracy of procuring services to help is quite complicated. Now, I've been on teams in the private sector where the company knows how much every customer service call costs them. And so they're trying to reduce the number of calls by increasing the usability of
Yep,
the
sure.
software so people can self-serve. Is there any concept in government of weighing those cost centers so that they see that increasing usability could have a monetary financial impact?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think that we are starting to see the framework that is sometimes helpful for me and that I generally kind of share is, I would say, this is anecdotal, right? But government, let's say, is 20 years behind like what's happening in the private sector. So you think about things like chatbots. We are still in the process of kind of like adding, and adding chatbots, and I'll use the phrase AI, but not in like the 2025 iteration of AI, but this idea that we can have a chatbot on a website that answers questions about filling out an application or submitting paperwork for X, Y, and Z. I mean, those conversations in many instances are happening now in public sector offices where we know that they have been around on private sector websites for years and years. So I do want to be cognizant that it's not that government necessarily is not ever having these conversations and thinking about these things. I think there's a lag. I think we know that the public sector is slower to adopt some of these technologies and ways of thinking. Like that research is out there. I think the other component to me that is interesting when we're using something like ROI is, of course, governments like want to do cost savings. I think, of course, they kind of want to.
Just return on investment for anyone that
Yes,
doesn't
sorry.
know.
I am a non-jargony person. That's probably the only acronym I will use.
Okay.
But, I think that, again, from my perspective, I think a lot of that stuff is driven in the private sector by a sense of competition, right? Platforms and companies are saying, we want to be faster, we want to be more user centric, we want to deliver especially a better technological experience for our users because we're competing with all of these other platforms and services that are doing the same thing. So, what's going to make us more efficient, more effective, have people pick us in this crowded playing field? I think the reality in the public sector is that sense of competition is not there. So
Okay.
if you need to pay your water bill, you need to log on to your municipality's water department website and pay your water bill. You're not shopping around for a better water experience.
Yeah, right.
And so I think from the perspective of that water department, you lose a little bit of the intrinsic motivation around like, why should this be better, faster, easier, cooler? Because the people are going to come to us no matter what. We want to do a giant asterisk, which is like not everyone thinks that way. There are many people, and we can talk more about this. There are many people in government that are now pushing back against this mentality. I'm just speaking kind of with broad strokes, based on the 12 years that I've spent in public sector spaces. And I'll say, and then I'll stop on this moment, but, I think I use the framing a lot though of because there's no competition, because we know that customers and residents and businesses have to go to this water department website to pay their water bill, isn't that the most intrinsic motivation for us wanting to deliver the best experience for those customers? Knowing that we are the only shop in town, don't we want that to be the best? Because that's why we're here. That's why people work in the public sector, is because they care about bringing services to people and communities. And I think like, shouldn't that be enough drive to be like, let's make this the best water payment website we've ever seen?
So there can be one attitude, which is, well, there's no pressure for us to make it better. They'll use it because they have to, versus a more positive and service oriented perspective that says they don't have any other options. And I want to make sure that this is the best
Totally.
experience for them. So really, it's the legacy technologies, the values and culture, the difficulty in procurement of services, and the market pressures, i.e., lack of competition, which bears out in the private world when you look at net promoter score, which is a promoter score, as a score that evaluates customer
Totally.
satisfaction
Yep.
in highly competitive industries like clothing or uh, goods, instruments, electronics. Those brands have really high net promoter scores because they need to excel in customer service and satisfaction to get chosen by the customer. As you move down, as you move towards industries with less competition like healthcare and telecom, the NPS goes from like they're competing in the 60s, right? Because you can only choose from like AT&T, Verizon,
Yep.
Boost
Yep.
Mobile, whatever.
Totally. And I'll say, just that's a really interesting note because I have worked on city levels and I've also worked at the state level. And I have recently kind of started to have conversations about what would it look like to introduce NPS into government platforms. And what if after you paid that water bill, you filled out a survey that said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied was I with this experience? A lot of times in an NPS score, you hear like, how likely am I to recommend this to someone else? And I think that we are moving towards a place as public sector innovation and as customer service and as digital transformation, I think starts to become a bigger focus of governments, which I wholeheartedly believe it is. I think we are seeing a change in the tides around valuing, not just an NPS as a quantitative measure, but like this idea of starting to value the customer experience more. You see governments hiring customer experience officers, we're starting to see, I think, of value in thinking about how do people feel about working with us, and then how does that inform how we move forward, our process improvement, our digital transformation, all these government systems that people have to engage with as part of their daily lives.
Right, 100%. And I think you may have said this when we originally spoke last week that, trust between residents and government is very fragile. So every
Yep.
experience matters to
Yes.
help citizens believe that the government is capable of doing what it is tasked to do.
Totally. Yes.
Okay, so given technology, values, procurement of technology support, and lack of market competition pressure, what does innovation mean in the context of government?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's obviously one that I've kind of built my whole career around. I used to kind of make the disclaimer that innovation in the public sector is not about, like, we are not building the next cool right? Like it's not an innovative widget necessarily that's going to change the way something happens. I think public sector innovation generally falls for me in the category of process improvement, culture change, kind of people realignment, kind of not reinventing the wheel, but just making the wheels that we have kind of move smoother, faster, etc. I tend to like share the very brief anecdote of a city department, that I have worked with in the past that um, had put in a request to buy typewriters because they had a series of forms that needed to be processed on a typewriter. And getting this agency to move from typewriter to email was the innovation. And I there's a world where you're like, holy crap, I can't believe that we're talking about a process on typewriters. But I think for me, the more important takeaway is like that's the incremental innovation that we're talking about in the public sector. I do think it's not to say that there are not moments of, I think, really big, really transformational innovation, building a new system, or like, to stick with my like water example, like there's lots of actual innovation that's happening kind of in the sustainability space around like quite literally how we are tackling these like big thorny challenges. Full disclosure, that is not my world, so I don't want to,
That's
I don't.
not the technology
Yeah,
piece.
exactly.
Right.
But, I think it's really, to me, public sector innovation is also, I would say 80-90% really about the culture change of thinking about how the public sector operates.
Mhm.
Making sure that we are training and empowering and making public sector employees aware of things they can do to make systems and policies and programs work better, and kind of breaking out of this mentality that government is slow and inefficient and bureaucratic and red tape and has a bunch of these like lifetime, public sector employees that don't really care about what's happening, breaking down that and rebuilding it as actually people who want to work for government, and the capacity of what government can do is just as good, and if not more impactful in some instances than like what we're seeing in the private sector. So how are we bringing those tools, that training, that attitude, skills to how government operates?
So, in a world where ripping out the technology, and to be honest, private sector can't really do it either. Like ripping out legacy technology is not an option. Bringing in external consultants just takes a lot of time. Really looking at process improvement. And so that's not just what the technology does or the technologies we use, but that's like, I used to say in the world of service design, human to human interactions, human to computer interactions, and computer to computer interactions. Like all three of those count. We're talking, like you said, process improvements and also the culture values of evolving to
Right.
be more oriented towards moving faster to providing better experiences.
Totally. Yep.
How do you think innovation is different in the private sector? ChatGPT is a huge innovation. iPhone was a huge innovation for its time. So innovation in the public sector is much more incremental.
That's what I think.
What's the relationship that risk plays in this, like the risk of innovation versus the risk of not changing?
Yeah. So, I think it's a really interesting question. And, I think qualitatively and like, I don't know, maybe from like an ethos perspective, the framing that I use when I talk to, let's say, other government employees about embracing this kind of work is like, okay, I know that you feel like innovating is risky, right? Like we are dealing with taxpayer dollars. We want to be good stewards of people's literally be good stewards of people's money. And I think be really respectful and responsive and cognizant of, representing the people that live and work in the municipalities that we work for. And that can feel scary, right? Like, what if we invest X amount of dollars in this thing and it doesn't work? Like, I get it. That's risky. I think basically what I say is similar to what I talked about earlier, which is like, yeah, but think about the risk of not innovating. Like, think about the risk of continuing to offer, in some instances, subpar experiences and services and programs that, in an immediate sense, don't serve the people in the way that they need to be served. And then I think, not to be like so meta here, but to kind of what you alluded to earlier, I really believe that every experience people have with government informs their future engagements with government. And if you go to apply for X, Y, and Z permit or license, let's say, and that application, that process is clunky and confusing and takes a really long time, and you get to page 6 and you realize you have to print something and then find a fax machine, which like is a real thing, like that immediately makes you feel like this government is broken.
Mhm.
And if I'm walking away from this engagement feeling like this government is broken, then in my like, I won't say doomsday scenario, but in my like play this out scenario, it's like, why do I then care about voting? Why do I then care about like being involved in my community? Because I have now just experienced that the government that is supposed to work for me and make my life better is like completely ridiculous. Whereas I think on the flip side, and we have seen this, like when people have a positive government experience, like, you can go online, you can go on I mean, I still call it Twitter, but you can go on X, whatever it might be. And you can see people be like, oh my God, I just had a shockingly great experience, like renewing my driver's license or like whatever it is. And there's this like tremendous sense of shock, right? That like government did something.
And enthusiasm, right?
Yes, and enthusiasm. And I think that that just like a negative experience begets, I think, a real negative mentality of the public sector. Positive experiences beget a much more positive view of the public sector. And I think that that's really important. And so that's my answer when people try to tell me that like innovating in the public sector is too risky. Let's talk about the risk of not innovating and like where that gets us.
I wonder if the word innovation, because it means something different in the private sector than the public sector, that it actually causes that perception of risk to say we need to innovate in the public sector. Because really, what you mean by innovate is like maybe let's move away from fax machine. Like that's actually not a huge risk,
Correct.
right?
100%. And I think um so I've been in the government innovation space for a long time. And let's say it was 2014 when I kind of like got in the game. And at that point, like I think that there was um innovation, literally the phrase innovation was really big in the private sector. And I think that there was a clear government really wanted to start adopting, again, quite literally that phrase. So you saw governments starting to build innovation teams. You saw foundations and philanthropies like Bloomberg really investing in things called government innovation. I think we then kind of like saw this arc where, let's say, 8 years later, no one even knew what government innovation meant anymore. And it was kind of up to, the way that we interpreted government innovation in our city was different than how this other city interpreted it, which was different than how this state interpreted it. Sometimes it was really connected to technology, sometimes it was really connected to like HR leadership, like it was all over the board. And I know that kind of the topic of our conversation is efficiency. And I actually think what we're seeing now is like innovation is a little bit maybe on the way out. Efficiency is in. I like the branding of innovation, like that feels important to me, but I also recognize that a lot of what I do, especially when we reflect on the content of this conversation, we're talking about culture change and process improvement and making things move faster and cost savings. That's government efficiency. And and some of this is like it's a little bit of marketing, it's a little bit of sales, it's a little bit of like what's hot in the moment. Government efficiency was never cool, right? Like in 2014,
Government
like
efficiency doesn't sound like
ex-
a cool
exactly.
thing.
Like, I was in my mid 20s. I wasn't going to apply for a job that was like government efficiency, but I applied for a job that was government innovation. And you know, the only thing that I am willing to concede at this moment in time is that government efficiency is a hot topic now. And there are those of us that have been in this world for a long time that in our hearts know we've been doing government efficiency for I've been doing it for 12 years. And I think understanding that arc is really important. I also think when we reflect on kind of like how we got to this moment in time.
Yeah. And if efficiency isn't sexy, innovation is, but really what's beautiful in like, and what has the most impact are these incremental improvements. Would chide myself for using the word beautiful, but now I think about it, it's like those incremental improvements turn into Twitter posts where someone is like, I renewed my license and didn't have any problems. And that actually brought them a smile.
Yes, it's really important.
So before we end the episode, like, who do you need
Yeah.
to propel government efficiency, optimization, and innovation for?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question to end on. I believe so deeply in the power of government. Like, I think it's in my LinkedIn profile. It's kind of how you introduced me in the beginning. Working in government and for government and with government has changed my life in all the ways. And I think that the the capacity for government to make people's lives better is really unparalleled, especially when the right people with the right motivations are in the right roles. And I think the question of like, what do we need right now to like make transformation successful or to like propel government efficiency forward in what I think is the right way, insert whatever phrase you want there. I think we need talented people who care about the world to consider working for government.
For specific talents, like technical
Think
talent,
I think tech is a huge
computer
one.
interaction.
I think the public sector in general really struggles with hiring tech talent in particular. There's probably a whole other podcast we could have just about why I think hiring tech talent in the public sector is hard, but we're talking about lower salaries. It's hard for government to be fully remote. Like, I think there are a lot of things that feel maybe more on its face, kind of compelling and competitive about the private sector tech market that truthfully government will never be able to match. I think though my hope would be that like after someone listens to a conversation and like this and has their moment of that's what I want to do. I want to build technology that impacts the people in my community that are doing things like paying their water bill and like renewing their driver's license, which, like, don't get me wrong, it's not sexy. Like, I get that, but it is so important. And I think once people get into government and kind of understand why we do things the way we do and how we operate, I think it's like an unparalleled opportunity to have impact and to learn and to grow. We have we've seen layoffs kind of over, let's say, the past 2 years. I would say big ones in the tech sector. And obviously now I know, really unfortunately, big ones at the federal level. And in both of those pools of people, I encourage especially folks that are in the tech, entrepreneurship, innovation, transformation world, to think about coming down to the state and local level.
Well, it's interesting. I can give you another positive coming from the startup world and the corporate world of digital innovation and transformation. In the startup world, it can feel like the wild, wild west. You're coming in every day and priorities are changing all the time and things feel really uncertain. So while you might be making more money at a startup, I think the stress level and time commitment and burden is a whole lot higher.
Yeah, it's a
So are, whatever money you're making, it's because you're selling a piece of you. And the government offers, and believe me, I've been on a lot of, you know, Bronco rides in the startup world. Like the appeal of the government is stability, right? Like is knowing.
I would say the appeal of government is stability, maybe not at this exact moment, because it is, I think it's important to recognize that like the public sector right now, even at the state and local level, can feel a little uncertain. And I think that's super fair.
Everyone feels uncertain right
But
now.
broadly speaking, government has a level of stability that I think does not exist, certainly in the startup world. And I do think to some large extent at kind of the big kind of anchor tech companies as
Well,
well.
I also say being at like big corporate tech or, even financial institutions and being in their digital departments, there's a lot of stuff you work on that never like sees the light of day. But the idea that maybe I could work on something at the DMV in Pennsylvania that affects how many million people live here, and actually see it come to life, that seems like a win. So I'm interested in seeing how the market pressures around technical talent and jobs kind of maybe pushes
Yeah,
people
totally.
into the government sector. All right, so let's make it make sense. Outdated legacy technologies, the culture, how we get help, the market pressure, lack thereof, competition can make innovation and efficiency really hard in the government. But it's also really awesome that incremental improvements that have to do with people and technology can go a long way to help a lot of people.